My wedding dress was torn and bloodstained when the paramedics found me unconscious on the bathroom floor of our honeymoon suite. I had been married for exactly 18 hours. The baby I didn't even know I was carrying was gone before I ever got the chance to hold her. That was 62 years ago, and this is the first time I'm telling this story to anyone outside my family. Hello, my beautiful souls. My name is Margaret Rose, but everyone calls me Grandma Maggie. I'm 78 years old, and I've been carrying this secret like a stone in my chest for most of my life. Today, I'm finally ready to share what really happened on what should have been the happiest night of my life, and how it led me down a path I never could have imagined. Some of you might wonder, why an old woman like me would tell such a painful story? The answer is simple, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that survival is possible, that life can be beautiful again even after the darkest moments, and that sometimes our greatest wounds become the source of our greatest strength. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, in a small town in Nebraska, where a naive young woman thought she had found her prince charming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was born in 1946 in Cedar Falls, Nebraska, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. My father, Robert Thompson, owned the local hardware store, and my mother, Helen, was the town's unofficial baker. Every church social, funeral, and celebration featured her famous apple pies and cinnamon rolls. We lived in a white two-story house with green shutters on Maple Street, the kind of house where screen doors slammed shut in summer and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen windows. I was the youngest of 3 children, with 2 older brothers, William and James, who treated me like their little princess. They taught me to ride a bicycle, to skip stones across Miller's Pond, and to always stand up for myself, advice that would prove both prophetic and tragically inadequate. My childhood was painted in Norman Rockwell colors. Summer days spent chasing fireflies, winter evenings huddled around our radio listening to The Lone Ranger, Sunday mornings in the front pew of Cedar Falls Methodist Church wearing my best dress with the white collar that Mother had sewn herself. I helped in my father's store after school, learning to count inventory and make change, developing the strong work ethic that would later save my life in ways I couldn't imagine. Margaret Rose, my mother would say while teaching me to knead dough. Remember that a woman's character is built in the quiet moments when no one is watching. How you treat people when you don't need anything from them. That's who you really are. Those words would echo in my mind during the darkest hours of my future, reminding me of who I was beneath all the pain. School came easily to me. I loved reading, lost myself in the worlds of Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, dreaming of grand romances and happy endings. My English teacher, Mrs. Patricia Anderson, encouraged my writing, telling me I had a gift for capturing emotion on paper. I wrote poetry in secret, filling notebook after notebook with verses about love and hope and the wide world beyond Nebraska's cornfields. By the time I turned 16 in 1962, I had grown into what the town ladies called a real beauty. Auburn, hair that caught fire in sunlight, green eyes that my brothers teasingly said could stop traffic, and a smile that made the church organist, old Mr. Fletcher, declare I could charm the birds from the trees. But more than my looks, I was known for my kindness. I volunteered at the church nursery, helped elderly neighbors with their grocery shopping, and never had a cruel word to say about anyone. It was this reputation for kindness that first attracted Thomas Mitchell to me. Thomas was new to Cedar Falls, having moved from Omaha in the spring of 1963 when I was 17. His father, Edwin Mitchell, had purchased the failing grain elevator on the outskirts of town, and Thomas, then 25, had come to help run the family business. He was 8 years older than me, which seemed sophisticated and worldly to a small-town girl who had never been further than Lincoln. The first time I saw Thomas was at Sunday service. He walked into our little church wearing a navy blue suit that clearly hadn't been purchased at Miller's General Store, his dark hair slicked back with pomade, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had seen the big city. He was handsome, in a classic way, strong jaw, broad shoulders, and deep brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. After the service, my mother, ever the hostess, invited the Mitchell family for Sunday dinner. "The Christian thing to do," she declared, "welcoming newcomers to our community." Thomas sat across from me at our dining room table, complimenting Mother's pot roast and asking Father thoughtful questions about the local farming community. He was charming, articulate, and showed genuine interest in our small-town ways without a trace of condescension. "Miss Margaret," he said as Mother served her famous apple pie, "your father tells me you help at the hardware store. That's quite admirable for a young lady. Most girls your age are only interested in movie magazines and makeup." I blushed at the compliment, pleased that he had noticed something beyond my appearance. "I enjoy it, Mr. Mitchell. There's satisfaction in helping people find exactly what they need to fix their problems." "Thomas, please," he smiled, and I felt something flutter in my chest that I had never experienced before. And I think that's a wonderful philosophy. Helping people solve their problems, the world needs more people like you. Looking back now, I recognize that first conversation as the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Thomas was a master at making people feel special, at saying exactly what they needed to hear. But at 17, with limited experience of the world beyond Cedar Falls, I heard only sincerity in his words. Our courtship began slowly, properly, under the watchful eyes of my parents and the entire town. Thomas would stop by the hardware store during his business rounds, always purchasing something: a box of nails, a length of rope, supplies he probably didn't need, just to chat with me while Father helped other customers. He brought Mother flowers from his business trips to Lincoln, complimented Father on his fair dealing and honest prices, and won over my brothers by showing genuine interest in their plans for college and careers. "He seems like a good man," my father said one evening after Thomas had spent dinner regaling us with stories of his travels. "Respectful, hard-working, comes from a good family. 8 years isn't too much of an age difference when a man is established and ready to provide for a wife." My mother was more cautious, as mothers often are. "He's charming, certainly," she admitted while we washed dishes together. "But Margaret Rose, charm can hide many things. Watch how he treats people who can't do anything for him. The store clerks, the waitresses, the children. That will tell you more about his character than any sweet words he whispers in your ear." I thought I was watching. I thought I was being careful. When Thomas helped elderly Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries to her car, when he stopped to pet stray dogs on the street, when he listened patiently to young Bobby Martin's excited chatter about his baseball card collection, I saw what I wanted. To see a good, kind man who would make a wonderful husband and father. What I didn't see were the subtle signs of control that were already beginning to emerge. How he steered our conversations away from topics that didn't interest him. How he made gentle suggestions about my appearance. "You look so pretty in blue, Margaret. Much better than that yellow dress." That I took as preferences rather than commands. How he gradually began monopolizing my time, suggesting we skip church socials or family gatherings to spend time alone together. "Thomas says the Hendersons' barn dance will be too crowded and noisy," I told my mother when declining yet another community invitation. "He'd rather we take a quiet walk by the pond." "And what do you want to do, Margaret Rose?" she asked pointedly. The question caught me off guard. I realized I had stopped considering my own preferences, so I focused on pleasing this wonderful man who had chosen me out of all the girls in 3 counties. "I want to make Thomas happy," I replied, not understanding that I had already begun to lose myself. Our engagement came in December of 1963, just 8 months after we met. Thomas proposed on Christmas Eve, presenting me with a small diamond ring that sparkled like captured starlight in the glow of our Christmas tree. The whole family was there: parents, brothers, grandparents who had driven in from Grand Island, and everyone cried happy tears as Thomas got down on one knee and asked for my hand in marriage. "Margaret Rose Thompson," he said, his voice warm with emotion, "you have brought light into my life in ways I never imagined possible. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Through my tears of joy, I whispered, "Yes," feeling like the luckiest girl in all of Nebraska. The ring slipped perfectly onto my finger, and as Thomas kissed me gently in front of our families, I believed with every fiber of my being that I was living the beginning of my own fairy tale. The engagement period stretched through the winter and into spring. We planned a June wedding. "June brides are the happiest brides," Thomas declared, and I threw myself into preparations with the enthusiasm of every small-town girl living her dream. Mother and I spent hours poring over patterns for my wedding dress, settling on a simple but elegant design with a fitted bodice, full skirt, and long train that would trail behind me down the aisle of Cedar Falls Methodist Church. Thomas was the perfect fiancé during those months. He sent flowers on Valentine's Day, remembered the anniversary of our first meeting, and spoke eloquently to anyone who would listen about how lucky he was to have found such a perfect wife. He accompanied me to every wedding-related appointment, offering opinions on flowers, cake flavors, and music selections with what I interpreted as caring involvement in our special day. "You're so fortunate, Margaret," sighed my friend Susan. Parker, whose own boyfriend seemed far less interested in wedding planning. "Thomas cares about every detail. He really loves you." And I believed he did. When he suggested we serve his favorite chocolate cake instead of the traditional white cake I had imagined, I saw it as a compromise. When he insisted on hiring the band from Omaha rather than the local musicians I had grown up with, I told myself he wanted our wedding to be special and memorable. When he diplomatically redirected my suggestions about the guest list, the flowers, and the reception menu, I convinced myself that his experience with city ways made him a better judge of what would be appropriate. Looking back, I can see that, even then, Thomas was establishing the pattern that would define our marriage. His preferences became our decisions, his opinions became our truth, and my desires became negotiable accessories to his grand design. But at 18 years old, in love for the first time, I interpreted his control as devotion and his manipulation as caring guidance. The wedding was set for June 12, 1964. I would be 18 years and 3 months old, a woman in the eyes of the law, but still, in so many ways, a trusting child who believed that love conquered all and that the man I was about to marry was exactly who he appeared to be. As spring turned to early summer and our wedding day approached, I had no idea that I was walking toward the edge of a cliff, that the life I had known was about to end forever, and that the man I loved was about to show me a side of himself that would shatter every innocent belief I had ever held about love, marriage, and human nature. The stage was set, the players were in position, and I was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like Prince Charming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. June 12, 1964, dawned with the kind of golden Nebraska sunshine that poets write about. I woke before sunrise in my childhood bedroom for the last time, my wedding dress hanging like a ghostly promise on the closet door. The house was already buzzing with activity. Mother in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the army of relatives who had arrived the night before, my brothers arguing over who would get the bathroom first, and the distant sound of my father testing the car horn that would announce our departure for the church. "Today's the day, little sister," William said, poking his head into my room as I sat in my vanity, staring at my reflection in the morning light. "Are you ready to become Mrs. Thomas Mitchell?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything," I replied, and in that moment, I truly believed it. The nervous flutter in my stomach felt like excitement, not the warning my body was trying to give. My wedding preparations began early. Susan Parker and my cousin Emily arrived at 8 o'clock to help me get ready, their arms full of curling irons, makeup cases, and enough hairspray to shellac a barn. We had practiced this routine 3 times, but today everything felt different, more significant, more precious, more permanent. "Margaret, you're absolutely glowing," Emily said as she carefully pinned small white roses into my auburn hair. "I've never seen a bride look more beautiful." My mother appeared in the doorway, tears already threatening her carefully applied mascara. In her hands was a small blue velvet box. "Something blue," she said softly, opening it to reveal a delicate pearl necklace. "This was your grandmother's. She wore it on her wedding day in 1923, and I wore it on mine in 1945. Now it's your turn." The weight of the pearls around my neck felt like a blessing, connecting me to generations of women who had stood where I stood, feeling what I felt, believing in the promise of marriage and love and forever. I had no way of knowing that I would be the first to break that chain of happy marriages, that these pearls would soon be stained with tears and blood. The dress itself was a masterpiece. Mother and I had spent countless evenings working on it, every stitch placed with love and hope. The bodice fit perfectly, emphasizing my small waist, and the full skirt made me feel like a princess from the fairy tales I had loved as a child. The long train would sweep behind me down the aisle, making me feel regal and special and chosen. "You look like an angel," Susan whispered as we made the final adjustments. "Thomas is the luckiest man alive." At precisely 10:30, the photographer arrived, Mr. Samuel Henderson from Lincoln, whom Thomas had insisted on hiring instead of the local man who had photographed every wedding in Cedar Falls for 20 years. "We want professional quality," Thomas had explained. "This day deserves the best." The photo session was extensive. Pictures of me alone in my dress, pictures with my mother and the other women, pictures with my brothers looking handsome and proud in their matching gray suits. Every pose was directed by Mr. Henderson, who had clear ideas about how things should look. "Tilt your chin just slightly, Miss Thompson," he instructed. "Think about your happiness. Think about your future with Mr. Mitchell." I thought about Thomas, waiting for me at the church, probably adjusting his tie nervously, maybe pacing in the small room behind the altar where grooms traditionally waited. I pictured his face when he saw me walking down the aisle, imagining the love and pride in his eyes, the way his hand would feel when it closed around mine at the altar. The drive to the church was a blur of well-wishers lining the streets, horns honking in celebration, and my father's steady hand covering mine as we sat in the back of his carefully polished Buick. "You know I love you, Margaret Rose," he said quietly. "And if you ever need anything at all, you come home. A father's door is always open for his daughter." Those words would haunt me in the months to come, when home seemed like a distant memory and my father's protection felt like something from another lifetime. Cedar Falls Methodist Church had been transformed into a wonderland. White roses and baby's breath adorned every pew. Candlelight flickered from tall brass holders at the altar, and the warm June air carried the scent of flowers and possibility. The church was packed. It seemed like the entire town had come to witness Margaret Thompson become Mrs. Thomas Mitchell. As we waited in the narthex for my cue to enter, I could hear the murmur of conversation from inside the sanctuary, punctuated by the occasional laugh or cough. The organist began the processional music. The wedding march played on the same organ where I had heard it countless times at other people's weddings, never imagining how different it would sound when it was meant for me. "Ready, sweetheart?" my father asked, offering me his arm. The doors opened, and suddenly I was walking down the aisle of my childhood church, past faces I had known all my life, toward the man I believed was my destiny. The sanctuary fell silent except for the music and the rustle of my dress against the carpet. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention, their joy and approval washing over me like warm sunshine. And there was Thomas, waiting at the altar. He looked magnificent in his black tuxedo, more handsome than I had ever seen him. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his posture straight and confident, and when our eyes met, he smiled the smile that had first captured my heart 18 months ago. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us, connected by love, and promise and the future we were about to build together. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with the gravity and joy that marked all the important moments in our small community. His words about love and commitment, about the sacred nature of marriage, about two becoming one in the sight of God, seemed to resonate with special meaning in that moment. Thomas and I had attended the required pre-marriage counseling sessions, where we had discussed our hopes for children, our plans for the future, our commitment to working through difficulties together. Do you, Thomas Edwin Mitchell, take Margaret Rose Thompson to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, Thomas said, his voice strong and clear, his eyes never leaving mine. Do you, Margaret Rose Thompson, take Thomas Edwin Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The rings we exchanged were simple gold bands. Thomas had insisted on traditional, classic designs that would never go out of style. As he slipped my ring onto my finger, his hands were steady and warm, and I remember thinking that this was the moment my real life began, that everything before had been just preparation for becoming Thomas Mitchell's wife. You may kiss the bride, Reverend Matthews announced, and Thomas lifted my veil with gentle hands before leaning down to kiss me softly, sweetly, in front of God and our community and everyone we loved. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and as we turned to walk back down the aisle as husband and wife, I felt like I was floating on air. The faces of our guests blurred together in a sea of smiles and tears and joy, and all I could think was that this was the happiest moment of my life, that everything from here on would be wonderful because Thomas and I were finally, officially, forever together. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with more white roses and round tables covered in mother's best lace tablecloths. The Omaha band Thomas had hired played a mixture of traditional wedding music and popular songs from the radio, and the chocolate cake he had requested was displayed prominently on a table surrounded by gifts wrapped in white and silver paper. Changed into a pale blue going-away dress, something more practical for traveling, Mother had suggested, and Thomas appeared at my side in a gray suit that made him look like a successful businessman from the big city. We cut the cake together, his hand covering mine on the knife, and I laughed when he dabbed a tiny bit of frosting on my nose in the traditional playful gesture. "Save me some cake for later," he whispered in my ear, and something in his tone made me shiver, though I couldn't have said why. The evening flew by in a whirlwind of congratulations, dancing, and celebration. Thomas was the perfect groom, attentive without being possessive, charming to all our guests, gracious in receiving their good wishes and advice. He danced with my mother, shook hands with my father, and told anyone who would listen how lucky he felt to have married the most wonderful girl in Nebraska. "She's perfect," I heard him tell his business partner, Mr. Franklin, during a quiet moment near the gift table. "Absolutely perfect. Beautiful, obedient, raised right. She'll make an ideal wife." The word obedient struck me as odd. It seemed more appropriate for describing a well-trained dog than a wife. But before I could think too deeply about it, Susan grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the dance floor for one last song with my girlfriends. As the evening wound down, it came time for Thomas and me to leave for our honeymoon. We were driving to Lincoln for 3 nights at the Hotel Capitol, which Thomas described as the finest accommodation in the state. It would be my first time staying in a real hotel, my first time traveling anywhere with a man, my first time being alone with Thomas for an extended period. The goodbyes were tearful and joyful. My mother held me tight, whispering last-minute advice about being a good wife. My father shook Thomas's hand firmly and reminded him to take good care of his little girl. My brothers hugged me and joked about how they wouldn't miss having to share the bathroom anymore. "Write to us," Mother called as Thomas and I walked toward his car, which had been decorated with tin cans and a "Just Married" sign by my mischievous brothers. "Let us know how you're settling in." Thomas had packed our suitcases in the trunk earlier, and as he held the passenger door open for me, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that seemed entirely appropriate for a new bride, about to begin her married life. The drive to Lincoln would take about 2 hours, giving us time to talk about the wedding, about how perfect everything had been, about our plans for the future. As we pulled away from the church, I turned to wave one last time at our families and friends who had gathered on the front steps to see us off. They looked so happy, so proud, so confident that Thomas and I were destined for a lifetime of joy together. Mother was crying again, but they were tears of happiness, and even my usually stoic father had moisture in his eyes. "Ready for our new adventure, Mrs. Mitchell?" Thomas asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand as we drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls. "More than ready," I replied, settling back against the car seat and watching my hometown disappear behind us. I can't wait to see what comes next. I had no idea that within 12 hours I would be lying unconscious in a hospital bed, that my wedding dress would be thrown away because it was too stained with blood to salvage, and that the baby I didn't even know I was carrying would be gone forever. I had no idea that the man sitting beside me, humming along to the radio and occasionally commenting on the scenery, was capable of violence that would make the devil himself recoil in horror. In that moment, driving toward Lincoln in the gathering, dusk of what had been the most beautiful day of my life, I was still Margaret Rose Thompson Mitchell, 18 years old and innocent, believing in love and marriage and happily ever after. But that girl was about to die, and the woman who would take her place would be forged in pain and terror and loss that no human being should have to endure. The Hotel Capitol loomed ahead of us in the distance, its lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky, and I had no idea I was driving toward my own personal hell. The Hotel Capitol was everything Thomas had promised. Elegant, sophisticated, with crystal chandeliers in the lobby and thick carpets that muffled footsteps. The bellhop who carried our luggage to the elevator smiled knowingly when he saw the "Just Married" sign still attached to Thomas's car keys, offering congratulations that made me blush with the sweet embarrassment of a new bride. "The honeymoon suite," Thomas announced proudly as we followed the bellhop down a long hallway lined with oil paintings of Nebraska landscapes. "Nothing but the best for my wife." My wife. The words still sent a thrill through me. After 18 months of being his fiancée, I was now officially Mrs. Thomas Mitchell, and everything about this moment felt like a dream come true. The suite was beautiful. A sitting area with a burgundy velvet sofa and matching chairs, heavy drapes that blocked out the city lights, and through an archway, a bedroom with a 4-poster bed covered in white linens. Red roses sat on the dresser, and champagne chilled in a silver bucket by the window. Thomas had thought of everything to make our first night as husband and wife special and memorable. "It's perfect," I breathed, turning in a slow circle to take in every detail. "Thomas, this must have cost a fortune." "Nothing's too expensive for you," he said, but something in his voice had changed since we'd entered the room. The warmth and tenderness from the car ride had been replaced by something I couldn't quite identify, something that made my skin prickle with an uneasiness I didn't understand. The bellhop departed with his tip, and suddenly we were alone. Truly, alone for the first time since our engagement. The silence felt different from the comfortable quiet we had shared during our courtship, heavier, more charged, almost threatening. "Would you like some champagne?" Thomas asked, but he was already opening the bottle before I could answer. The cork popped with a sound that made me jump, and he laughed. "Nervous, sweetheart?" "A little," I admitted, accepting the glass he offered. "It's just, everything is so new." "You'll get used to it," he said. And again, something in his tone made me look at him more closely. His smile was the same, but his eyes seemed different, harder somehow, more calculating. "Drink up. It'll help you relax." I sipped the champagne, feeling the bubbles tickle my nose and throat. It was my first taste of alcohol. Mother and father had raised us in a strictly temperance household, and the unfamiliar sensation made me dizzy almost immediately. "I should probably change out of this dress," I said, gesturing toward my going-away outfit, which suddenly felt too formal for the intimate setting. "I brought a nightgown." "Yes," Thomas said, his voice taking on a tone I had never heard before, low, almost growling. "You should change into something more appropriate for a wife." I gathered my overnight case and headed toward the bathroom, but Thomas caught my wrist as I passed. His grip was firm, almost painful, and when I looked down at his fingers wrapped around my arm, I could see white marks where he was pressing too hard. "Thomas, you're hurting me," I said with a nervous laugh, trying to pull away. Instead of releasing me, his grip tightened. "Am I?" he asked, and for the first time, I heard something in his voice that sent cold fear racing down my spine. "Interesting. I haven't even started yet." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile was nothing like the gentle expressions I had fallen in love with. This smile was cold, predatory, the smile of something that had been hiding behind a mask for 18 months and was finally ready to reveal its true face. "I mean, my dear wife, it's time for you to learn what marriage really means. What being my wife really means." He pulled me closer, and I could smell the champagne on his breath, mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the way wild animals smelled at the county fair. "You belong to me now, Margaret. Completely. Totally, body and soul." I tried to step back, but his grip on my wrist prevented any movement. "Thomas, you're scaring me. Please let go." "Scaring you?" He laughed, but it was a sound without any humor. "Oh, sweetheart, you have no idea what fear is, but you're about to learn." With his free hand, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something I had never seen before. A length of rope, obviously purchased and prepared in advance. The sight of it made my blood turn to ice water. "What is that for?" I managed to ask, though my throat felt like it was closing. "For you, my beautiful bride. To help you understand your new role in life." His grip shifted to my upper arm, and he began dragging me toward the bedroom. "You see, Margaret, all those months of courtship, all those sweet words and gentle kisses, that was just the bait. You took it so beautifully, so completely, just like I knew you would." The realization hit me like a physical blow. You planned this? All of it?" "Every single moment," he confirmed, his voice filled with pride. "From the first time I saw you in that church, so innocent, so trusting, so perfectly breakable, I knew you were exactly what I was looking for." We had reached the bedroom, and he pushed me roughly onto the bed. I tried to scramble away, but he was faster, stronger, and within seconds he had caught my ankles and was pulling me back toward him. "Please, Thomas," I begged, tears starting to blur my vision. "Please don't do this. I'm your wife. I love you." "Love?" He laughed again, that horrible sound that would haunt my nightmares for decades to come. "You stupid little girl. This isn't about love. This is about power, about ownership, about showing you exactly what you are. Property. My property. The Next hours were a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. Thomas revealed himself to be something completely different from the man I had fallen in love with. The gentle touches became brutal grabs, the sweet words became vicious curses, and the romantic wedding night I had dreamed of became a horror show of violence and cruelty that would scar me forever. He used the rope to tie my wrists to the bedposts, ignoring my pleas and sobs. When I screamed, he stuffed a pillowcase into my mouth, muffling my cries until they became pitiful whimpers that seemed to excite him even more. "This is what marriage really is," he whispered in my ear as I lay there, helpless and terrified. "This is what wives are for, to be used, to be broken, to learn their place." The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional devastation was worse. This was the man I had promised to love, honor, and obey just hours before. This was the person I had trusted with my heart, my future, my life. Every gentle moment of our courtship had been a lie. Every sweet word a calculated manipulation designed to trap me in this moment of absolute vulnerability. But the worst was yet to come. As the night wore on, Thomas's violence escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. He seemed to take pleasure not just in hurting me, but in describing what he planned to do next, in watching the fear in my eyes grow with each new threat. It was during one particularly brutal assault that I felt something tear inside me. A sharp, tearing pain that was different from everything else he had inflicted. I cried out through the gag, and for a moment Thomas paused. "What's wrong?" he demanded, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked almost like disappointment. "We're just getting started." But something was very wrong. I could feel wetness spreading beneath me. And when Thomas pulled away, I saw his face change from cruel pleasure to something like alarm. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking down at the blood that was staining the white hotel sheets. More blood than there should have been. Much more. The pain in my abdomen was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Sharp, cramping, and getting worse by the minute. I tried to curl up on my side, but the ropes prevented any real movement. "Thomas," I tried to say through the gag, but it came out as an incoherent mumble. He pulled the pillowcase from my mouth, and I gasped for air before managing to whisper, "Something's wrong." Something's really wrong. The bleeding was getting heavier, and the cramping was now accompanied by waves of nausea that made the room spin around me. Thomas untied my wrists, but by then I was too weak to move, too dizzy to do anything but lie there and watch the white sheets turn red beneath me. "Get up," Thomas ordered, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Stop being dramatic." "I can't," I whispered. "Thomas, I think I need a doctor." "You don't need anything except to learn how to take what I give you," he snapped, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. The room was beginning to fade in and out of focus, and I could feel myself growing weaker by the minute. Whatever was happening inside my body was serious. More serious than Thomas's twisted games. More serious than his need to hurt and control me. "Please," I managed to whisper before another wave of pain hit me. "Please help me." But Thomas wasn't interested in helping. He was only interested in continuing his assault, in proving his dominance, in breaking me completely. Even as I lay there bleeding and in agony, he reached for me again. That's when everything went black. The last thing I remembered was the sound of my own heartbeat growing fainter and fainter, the sensation of floating away from my body, and a strange sense of peace as consciousness slipped away from me. I had no way of knowing that I was dying. I had no way of knowing that the life growing inside me, a life I hadn't even known existed, was dying too. I had no way of knowing that it would be 18 hours before anyone found me, that the hotel staff would discover me unconscious and barely breathing in a room that looked like a slaughterhouse. And I had no way of knowing that when I finally woke up, everything I had believed about love, marriage, trust, and human nature would be gone forever. replaced by knowledge that no 18-year-old girl should ever have to carry. The innocent girl who had walked down the aisle 12 hours earlier was gone, murdered as surely as if Thomas had put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger. In her place would be someone I didn't recognize, someone who would have to learn how to live with scars that would never fully heal. But first, I had to survive. And survival, I was about to learn, was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done. The first thing I became aware of was the sound, a steady beeping that seemed to come from inside my head. Then came the smell, sharp and antiseptic, nothing like the rose-scented hotel room that lingered in my fragmented memories. My eyelids felt heavy, as if they were made of lead, but I forced them open to find myself staring at a white ceiling marked with water stains and harsh fluorescent lights. I wasn't in the hotel capitol anymore. Panic tried to rise in my chest, but my body felt disconnected from my mind, floating in a strange, cottony haze that made coherent thought nearly impossible. I attempted to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my abdomen, forcing me back down onto what I now realized was a hospital bed. "Easy there, honey," came a gentle voice from my left. "You're safe now. You're in Lincoln General Hospital." I turned, my head slowly, every movement feeling like it required enormous effort, and saw a middle-aged woman in a white nurse's uniform sitting beside my bed. Her face was kind but tired, and her eyes held a mixture of professional concern and something else, something that looked like pity. "What?" I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a croak. My throat felt raw, as if I had been screaming for hours. "Here, drink this," the nurse said, holding a cup of water with a straw to my lips. The cool liquid felt like heaven against my parched throat. "Small sips now. You've been unconscious for almost 2 days." 2 days? The words didn't make sense. I remembered the hotel room, remembered Thomas's face changing from loving to something monstrous, remembered pain and fear, and then nothing. "Where is my husband?" I managed to ask, though speaking those words felt like swallowing broken glass. The nurse's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions. But first, let me get to Dr. Harrison. He's been waiting for you to wake up." She pressed a button on a device beside my bed, and within minutes, a tall man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses entered the room. He wore a white coat and carried a clipboard, but his eyes were the same as the nurse's, kind but haunted by whatever they had seen. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, pulling a chair close to my bed. "I'm Dr. Harrison. How are you feeling?" "Confused," I admitted. "Scared. What happened to me? Why am I here?" Dr. Harrison exchanged a glance with the nurse before speaking. "You were brought here by ambulance 2 days ago. The hotel staff found you unconscious in your room. You had lost a significant amount of blood due to—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Due to internal injuries." Internal injuries. The clinical term didn't capture the reality of what Thomas had done to me, but I could see, in the doctor's face, that he understood the true nature of my wounds. "Mrs. Mitchell," he continued gently, "I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. When you were brought in, we discovered that you had been pregnant. Very early. Probably only a few weeks along. You likely didn't even know." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pregnant. I had been carrying a baby, Thomas's baby, and now I lost it, I whispered, and it wasn't a question. "I'm very sorry," Dr. Harrison said. "The trauma to your body was extensive. There was nothing we could have done to save the pregnancy." A baby. I had lost a baby I never knew I was carrying. A child who had died because of what Thomas had done to me on what should have been the most beautiful night of my life. The grief hit me, like a tidal wave, overwhelming and immediate. "Where is Thomas?" I asked again, though part of me already knew the answer. Your husband brought you to the hospital, the nurse said carefully. He told the staff that you had fallen down the stairs at the hotel. He seemed very concerned about you. I fell down the stairs. Even in my drugged, confused state, I could recognize the lie for what it was. Thomas had created a story to explain my injuries, to make himself look like the caring husband, rather than the monster who had put me in this bed. He left after the doctors told him you were stable, Dr. Harrison added. He said he had to return to work, but that he would be back to check on you. But I knew he wouldn't be back. Something in my gut told me that Thomas was gone, that he had accomplished whatever sick goal he had set for himself, and was now moving on to the next phase of his plan, or perhaps to the next victim. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Harrison said, leaning forward slightly, I need to ask you directly. Did your husband do this to you? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I could tell the truth. Describe the horror of that night, the rope, the violence, the premeditated cruelty, or I could maintain the lie that Thomas had created, protect him even after what he had done to me. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Dr. Harrison waited patiently, his eyes never leaving my face, while the nurse held my hand with gentle pressure. I started, then stopped. The words felt too big, too terrible to speak aloud. How could I explain that the man I had married just days ago had turned into something inhuman? How could I describe the rope, the gag, the calculated way he had hurt me? How could I tell them about the baby I had lost to his violence? He fell down the stairs, I finally whispered, echoing the lie that Thomas had told. I was tired from the wedding, and I slipped in the bathroom. Hit my head. I saw disappointment flicker across Dr. Harrison's face, but he nodded as if he had expected my answer. Mrs. Mitchell, if you ever want to talk about what really happened, I want you to know that anything you tell me will be kept in strict confidence, and there are people who can help you if you need help. Thank you, I whispered, but we both knew I wasn't ready to accept that help. Not yet. The next few days passed in a blur of medical procedures, visits from nurses, and long stretches of staring at the ceiling while trying to make sense of what had happened to my life. My parents drove down from Cedar Falls as soon as they heard I was in the hospital, and seeing their faces when they walked into my room nearly broke my heart all over again. Oh, sweetheart, my mother said, rushing to my bedside with tears streaming down her face. We came as soon as Thomas called us. He said you had an accident. I'm okay, Mama, I lied, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face in half. Just clumsy, I guess. My father stood at the foot of my bed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with an anger I had never seen before. Where is that husband of yours? He asked, his voice carefully, controlled. Thomas said he would meet us here. He had to go back to work. I repeated the lie that was becoming easier to tell with each repetition. You know how it is with business. But my father wasn't fooled. He had been watching my face while I spoke, and I could see in his expression that he knew something was terribly wrong. Margaret Rose, he said quietly, using my full name the way he did when he was being completely serious. Did Thomas do this to you? The question from my father hit differently than when Dr. Harrison had asked it. My father had known me for 18 years, had watched me grow up, had walked me down the aisle just days ago. He could read my face like a book, and he could see through any lie I tried to tell. Daddy, I started, but the word came out as a sob. That's what I thought, he said grimly. Where is he, Margaret? Where is Thomas? I don't know, I admitted, the truth finally spilling out. He hasn't been back since the first night. The nurses say he left after they told him I was stable. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He left you? He left you here alone? The reality of the situation was starting to sink in for all of us. Thomas had brought me to the hospital to save himself from potential murder charges, had created a plausible story about my injuries, and then disappeared, leaving me to deal with the consequences of his violence alone. "We're taking you home," my father said firmly. "As soon as the doctors say you can travel, you're coming home with us." "But I'm married now," I protested weakly. "Thomas is my husband. I should wait for him to come back." "Thomas Mitchell is not your husband," my father said with a vehemence. That startled me. A husband protects his wife. A husband stays by her side when she's hurt. A husband doesn't abandon her in a hospital bed. Whatever that man is, he's not fit to be called a husband. Deep down, I knew my father was right. But admitting it would mean accepting that my marriage was over before it had really begun. That the man I had loved was a monster. That everything I had believed about my future was a lie. "I want to go home," I whispered, and saying those words felt like admitting defeat. "Then home you'll come," my mother said, smoothing my hair back from my forehead. "We'll take care of you, sweetheart. Everything will be okay." But I knew it. Wouldn't be okay. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever. The next morning, Dr. Harrison came to see me one final time before my discharge. He sat down in the same chair he had occupied during our first conversation. But this time his expression was more serious, more urgent. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "I want you to know that what happened to you was not your fault. Whatever your husband told you, whatever he made you believe about yourself, none of this was your fault." I nodded, but I'm not sure I believed him. Some part of me was already beginning to wonder if I had done something wrong, if I had somehow provoked Thomas's violence, if I was somehow to blame for losing the baby I had never known I was carrying. "I also want you to know," Dr. Harrison continued, "that the injuries you sustained were severe. There may be complications in the future. With pregnancy, I mean. You should know that having children might be difficult for you now. Another blow, another loss. Not only had Thomas taken my innocence, my trust, and my first pregnancy, but he might have taken my ability to have children in the future as well." "Will I ever be normal again?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Dr. Harrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Normal is different for everyone, Mrs. Mitchell. Your body will heal, most of it, anyway. But healing from trauma like this, that takes time. And it takes help. I hope you'll consider getting that help when you're ready." As my parents drove me home to Cedar Falls that afternoon, I stared out the window at the Nebraska countryside rolling past and realized that the girl who had left this town just a week ago was gone forever. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who had seen the worst that human nature had to offer, someone who had lost a child to violence, someone who would have to learn how to live with scars that would never fully heal. But I was alive, broken, traumatized, and forever changed, but alive. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, survival is enough to build a new life upon. Even if that new life looked nothing like the one I had planned. Returning to my childhood bedroom felt like stepping backward through time, except everything was wrong. The same pink wallpaper with tiny roses still covered the walls, the same white furniture sat in the same positions, and the same lace curtains filtered the Nebraska sunlight just as they had when I was a girl. But I was no longer the person who had once called this room home. My mother had prepared everything with the desperate care of someone trying to heal wounds she couldn't see. Fresh sheets on the bed, my favorite quilt folded at the foot, a bouquet of daisies from her garden on the nightstand. She had even retrieved my old stuffed rabbit, Mr. Patches, from the cedar chest and placed him on my pillow, a gesture so tender and heartbreaking that I had to turn away to hide my tears. "I thought you might want some familiar things," she said softly, hovering in the doorway as if afraid to come too close. "I know you're not a little girl anymore, but sometimes when we're hurt, we need reminders of when we felt safe. Safe. The word felt foreign now, like something from a language I had once known but could no longer speak fluently. The first few days were a careful dance of avoidance. My parents tiptoed around me as if I were made of spun glass, speaking in hushed tones and watching me with worried eyes when they thought I wasn't looking. My brothers, William and James, had driven home from their respective colleges as soon as they heard about my accident, and their presence filled the house with attention that everyone pretended not to notice. "So when is Thomas coming to visit?" William asked during dinner on my third day home, his voice carrying an edge that made Mother shoot him a warning look. "He's very busy with work," I replied automatically, pushing food around my plate without eating. The lie was becoming easier to tell, but no less bitter. "Too busy to check on his wife?" James pressed, ignoring Mother's increasingly frantic signals to drop the subject. "What kind of man leaves his bride in the hospital alone?" "Boys," Father said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had kept us in line throughout childhood. "That's enough." But I could see in their faces that they weren't satisfied with my vague explanations. My brothers had always been protective of me, and Thomas's absence was raising questions that I wasn't ready to answer. The truth was that I didn't know where Thomas was or what he was doing. For all I knew, he had returned to Omaha, or moved on to some other town where he could reinvent himself as the charming, successful businessman who had swept me off my feet. The thought that he might be courting another innocent girl, preparing to destroy another life the way he had destroyed mine, made me physically ill. Sleep became my enemy. During the day, I could distract myself with books, with helping Mother in the kitchen, with sitting on the front porch and watching the familiar rhythms of small-town life continue, as if my world hadn't completely collapsed. But at night, when darkness fell and the house grew quiet, the memories would return with a vengeance. I would lie in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and reliving every moment of that horrible night. The sound of Thomas's laughter when he revealed his true nature, the feeling of the rope around my wrists, the moment I realized that the man I loved had never existed at all, that he had been nothing more than a carefully constructed mask worn by a monster. And then there were the dreams about the baby, the child I had never known I was carrying, who had died because of Thomas's violence. In my nightmares, I would hold a faceless infant who would turn to smoke in my arms, or I would hear a baby crying somewhere in the distance, but never be able to find the source of the sound. It was during one of these sleepless nights, about a week after returning home, that my father knocked softly on my door. "Margaret Rose, are you awake?" "Come in, Daddy," I called softly, sitting up and turning on the bedside lamp. He entered carrying 2 cups of warm milk, something he had done when I was small and troubled by bad dreams. He handed me a cup and sat in the small chair by my window, the same chair where he had read me bedtime stories when I was little. "Can't sleep?" he asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. "Not much," I admitted, wrapping my hands around the warm cup and inhaling the comforting scent of vanilla that Mother always added to nighttime milk. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the night sounds of Cedar Falls. Crickets chirping, the distant sound of a train whistle, the settling creaks of our old house. "Your mother and I have been talking," Father finally said, his voice careful and measured. "We think it might be good for you to talk to someone about what happened, about what you're going through." "I'm fine, Daddy," I said automatically, the same response I gave to everyone who asked. "No, sweetheart, you're not fine, and that's okay. What happened to you? It's not something a person should have to carry alone." The gentleness in his voice nearly broke down the walls I had built around my emotions. What would people say? If they knew the truth about Thomas, about what he did to me? People will always talk, Margaret Rose. That's the nature of small towns. But the people who matter, the people who truly love you, their opinion of you won't change because some sick man hurt you. But I married him, Daddy. I chose him. I trusted him. How could I have been so wrong about someone? Father sat down, his cup and leaned forward, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Listen to me very carefully. What Thomas Mitchell did to you was not your fault. Not in any way, shape, or form. He is a predator who saw a kind, trusting young woman and decided to hurt her. That says nothing about you and everything about him." "But the signs were there," I protested. "Looking back, I can see them now. The way he controlled our conversations, how he made all the decisions about the wedding, how he isolated me from my friends. Mother even warned me to watch how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him. Predators are experts at hiding. Their true nature," Father said firmly. "They spend their entire lives learning how to manipulate and deceive. You were 18 years old, raised in a loving home, taught to see the good in people. You had no experience with evil like that, and thank God for it. The fact that you trusted him doesn't make you naive, it makes you normal." His words were like a balm on wounds I didn't even realize were still bleeding. For the first time since that horrible night, I felt some of the crushing weight of guilt begin to lift from my shoulders. "There's something else," I said quietly, and Father waited patiently for me to continue. "Dr. Harrison said that because of what Thomas did to me, I might not be able to have children in the future. The damage was extensive." Father's face went very still, and I saw his hands clenched into fists in his lap. "That monster," he said quietly, his voice filled with a rage I had never heard from him before. "That absolute monster. I keep thinking about the baby I lost," I continued, the words tumbling out now that I had finally started talking. "I didn't even know I was pregnant, but when Dr. Harrison told me, I felt this incredible grief. Like I had lost something precious that I had never even known I had." "You did lose something precious," Father said gently, "and it's okay to grieve for that child, even if you never knew about them. Grief doesn't follow rules or timelines." "I keep wondering what they would have looked like," I whispered. "Whether they would have had my eyes or Thomas's hair. Whether they would have been a boy or a girl. And then I feel guilty for grieving, because maybe it's better that they never had to live with Thomas as a father." "You can feel all of those things at once," Father said. "Grief is complicated. It doesn't make sense most of the time. But you have every right to mourn that baby, and you have every right to be angry about what was taken from you." We talked until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and by the time Father kissed my forehead and left me to try to get some rest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Not hoping that things would go back to the way they were before, because I knew that was impossible. But I hoped that maybe, eventually, I could build a new kind of life from the ashes of the old one. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, the town's only female lawyer, knocked on our front door carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expression of grim determination. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said when Mother led her into our living room, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about your legal options." "Legal options?" I asked, confused. "Regarding your marriage to Thomas Mitchell, and regarding the crimes he committed against you." The word crimes hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I had been thinking of what Thomas did as something terrible that had happened to me, but I hadn't really considered it in legal terms. "I don't understand," I said slowly. Mrs. Carter opened her briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents. "Margaret, what your husband did to you constitutes several serious felonies: assault, battery, sexual assault, and considering that you lost a pregnancy as a result of his violence, potentially even homicide charges could be filed." The room seemed to spin around me. Homicide? The death of an unborn child as the result of a violent crime is considered homicide in Nebraska law, she explained gently. "But more immediately, we need to discuss your marriage itself. Given that Thomas obtained your consent through fraud and deception, and given his subsequent abandonment, we have grounds for annulment." "Annulment?" It would be as if the marriage never legally existed. You would be Margaret Thompson again, not Margaret Mitchell. And it would free you from any legal obligations to Thomas, while also protecting you from any debts or legal troubles he might have. The possibility of erasing my marriage, of reclaiming my maiden name and my identity, was almost too good to believe. What would I have to do? First, you would need to file a police report detailing what Thomas did to you. Then we would file for annulment based on fraud, abandonment, and cruelty. The process might take several months, but I'm confident we will be successful. I looked around the room at my parents, who were watching me with expressions of hope and encouragement. I need to think about it, I said finally. Of course, Mrs. Carter said, gathering her papers. But Margaret, don't wait too long. The longer Thomas remains free, the more chance he has to hurt someone else. And the longer you remain legally tied to him, the harder it will be to truly move forward with your life. After she left, I sat on the front porch swing where I had spent so many childhood evenings, watching the sun set over the Nebraska prairie and thinking about the choice before me. I could stay silent, protect Thomas's reputation and my own privacy, and try to heal in secret. Or I could tell the truth, face the whispers and judgment that would inevitably follow, and try to prevent him from destroying another life the way he had destroyed mine. It wasn't really a choice at all. The next morning, I walked into the Cedar Falls police station with Mrs. Carter at my side, ready to tell the truth about Thomas Mitchell and begin the long process of reclaiming my life. The healing wouldn't be quick or easy, but it was finally going to begin. The Cedar Falls police station smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and something else I couldn't identify. Maybe fear, maybe desperation. It was a small building that I had walked past countless times during my childhood, never imagining that one day I would be sitting across from Sheriff Daniel Murphy, telling him about the worst night of my life. Sheriff Murphy was a heavyset man in his 50s who had known my family since before I was born. He had coached my brothers in Little League, had bought hardware from my father's store, had even dated my aunt briefly in high school. This familiarity should have made the conversation easier, but instead it made everything more complicated. Now, Margaret, he said, his voice carrying the gentle tone adults use with confused children, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. You're saying that Thomas Mitchell, your husband, assaulted you on your wedding night. Yes, sir, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Mrs. Carter sat beside me, her presence providing strength and legitimacy to my words. And you're saying this assault caused you to lose a pregnancy you didn't know about? That's correct. Sheriff Murphy leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. This is a serious accusation, Margaret. You understand that. Don't. You? You're talking about charging a man with assault, battery, and potentially manslaughter. I understand, I said, though the legal terminology still felt foreign and overwhelming. The thing is, Sheriff Murphy continued, tapping his pen against his desk, Thomas Mitchell brought you to the hospital himself. He seemed really concerned about you. Told the doctors you fell down some stairs. That doesn't sound like the behavior of a man who hurt his wife. Mrs. Carter leaned forward. Sheriff Murphy, as you well know, it's not uncommon for perpetrators of domestic violence to bring their victims to medical attention when the injuries become life-threatening. It's a way of avoiding murder charges while maintaining the appearance of being a caring spouse. I suppose, Sheriff Murphy said, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. The problem is, Margaret, we don't have any evidence except your word. No witnesses, no physical evidence that wasn't explained by the fall story. And now your husband has disappeared, so we can't even get his side of the story. My injuries were documented at the hospital, I said, feeling frustration beginning to build in my chest. Dr. Harrison can testify about the nature of the trauma. But doctors can't say for certain how injuries were caused, can they? A fall downstairs could cause the same kind of damage as other things. The way he said other things made it clear that Sheriff Murphy was uncomfortable with the entire conversation. This was 1964 in small-town Nebraska, where such matters were considered private family business, not police matters. "Sheriff," Mrs. Carter said firmly, "I'm filing a formal complaint against Thomas Mitchell on behalf of my client. Whether you choose to investigate it properly is up to you, but it will be on record." Sheriff Murphy sighed heavily. "I'll take the report," he said finally, "but I have to tell you, without more evidence and without the accused here to defend himself, this isn't likely to go anywhere." The report took over 2 hours to complete. Sheriff Murphy asked questions that made me relive every horrible moment of that night, writing down my answers in his slow, careful handwriting. By the time we finished, I felt raw and exposed, as if I had been turned inside out for examination. "One more thing," Sheriff Murphy said as we prepared to leave. "You might want to think carefully about pursuing this, Margaret. Thomas Mitchell is from a well-respected family in Omaha. They have money, influence, connections. This kind of accusation could backfire on you if you can't prove it." The warning was clear. I was a small-town girl going up against powerful people, and I might be the one who ended up destroyed. Word traveled fast in Cedar Falls. By the next morning, it seemed like everyone in town knew that Margaret Thompson had filed charges against her new husband. The looks I received when Mother and I went to Miller's General Store ranged from sympathy to curiosity to outright skepticism. "Is it true what they're saying about Thomas Mitchell?" asked Mrs. Harriet Jameson, the town's unofficial gossip coordinator, cornering me by the canned goods aisle. "I don't know what they're saying," I replied carefully. "They're saying you accused him of hurting you. On your wedding night." She leaned closer, her eyes bright with curiosity. "But Thomas seemed like such a nice young man. So polite, so well-dressed. Are you sure you're not just having newlywed troubles?" The implication was clear. I was either lying or being dramatic about normal marital difficulties. This conversation would be repeated dozens of times over the following weeks, with variations on the same theme. How could such a charming man be capable of violence? Surely I was exaggerating. Maybe I just wasn't prepared for married life, but there were also supporters. Mrs. Adelaide Foster, who ran the town's small lending library, pulled me aside one afternoon. "I want you to know that I believe you," she said quietly, glancing around, to make sure no one was listening. "My sister went through something similar with her first husband. She never reported it, and she regretted that decision for the rest of her life. You're brave to speak up." These moments of support were like lifelines thrown to a drowning person, reminding me that not everyone thought I was lying or crazy. The legal process moved slowly. Mrs. Carter filed for annulment of my marriage, citing fraud, abandonment, and cruelty. She also began working with authorities in Omaha to locate Thomas, though his family claimed they hadn't seen him since before the wedding. "They're lying," Mrs. Carter told me during one of our meetings. "I have a contact in Omaha who says Thomas was seen at his family's business just last week, but without cooperation from local police there, it's difficult to prove." Meanwhile, I tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I began helping at the library, organizing books, and assisting with the children's reading program. The work was quiet and peaceful, and Mrs. Foster never asked intrusive questions about my situation. It was during one of these library afternoons that I met someone who would change the trajectory of my healing. Dr. Ruth Williamson, a psychologist from Lincoln who was visiting Cedar Falls to research rural mental health services. "You're Margaret Thompson, aren't you?" she asked, approaching me as I shelved returned books. "I hope you don't mind, but I've heard about your situation, and I wanted to offer my services if you're interested." Dr. Williamson was unlike anyone I had ever met, a woman in her 40s who had never married, who had devoted her life to understanding and treating trauma. She wore practical clothes and sensible shoes, spoke directly without flinching from difficult topics, and had a presence that immediately put me at ease. "I don't think I need— I'm not crazy," I said, the common misconception about psychology making me defensive. "Of course you're not crazy," Dr. Williamson said with a smile, "but you've been through a severe trauma, and trauma changes the brain in measurable ways. Talking to someone trained to understand these changes can help with the healing process." Over the following months, I began meeting with Dr. Williamson weekly. She helped me understand that my nightmares, my sudden fears, my difficulty trusting people, all of these were normal responses to abnormal circumstances. "Trauma isn't just about what happened to you," she explained during one session. "It's about how that event changed your fundamental beliefs about safety, trust, and the world around you. Healing means learning to live with those changed beliefs while still being able to function and find joy." She introduced me to other women who had survived similar experiences, not in Cedar Falls where such things weren't discussed, but through a network of survivors she had developed in her practice. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone, that other women had endured similar horrors and found ways to rebuild their lives. 6 months after filing the initial police report, we finally got news about Thomas. He had been arrested in Colorado on charges unrelated to my case. Apparently, he had been involved in some kind of business fraud scheme. More importantly, the Colorado authorities discovered that Thomas Mitchell wasn't even his real name. His actual name is Robert Thomas Brennan, Mrs. Carter told me, reading from a telegram she had received from Colorado law enforcement. "He's been using false identities for years, moving from town to town, marrying young women, and then disappearing, with whatever money or valuables he can steal from them." The revelation was both devastating and vindicating. Devastating because it confirmed that everything about the man I had married had been a lie. His name, his background, his entire identity. Vindicating because it proved that I hadn't been naive or foolish to trust him. I had been the victim of a professional con artist and predator. "How many other women has he hurt?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The Colorado police think at least 6 that they know of," Mrs. Carter replied grimly. "And there are probably more who never reported what happened to them." This news changed everything about my case. Suddenly, I wasn't just a small-town girl making accusations against a respectable businessman. I was one of multiple victims of a career criminal, and my testimony became crucial evidence in a larger pattern of abuse. The Colorado authorities wanted me to travel there to testify in their case against Thomas, or Robert, as I was trying to learn to think of him. The prospect was terrifying, but Dr. Williamson helped me understand that testifying could be an important part of my healing process. Telling your story in a courtroom, having it officially acknowledged and believed, can help you reclaim your power, she explained. "You're not just a victim anymore. You're a survivor who is helping to ensure that other women don't suffer the same fate." The decision to testify wasn't easy. It meant reliving the trauma in public, facing cross-examination from defense attorneys who would try to make me look like a liar or a woman scorned. It meant having my most private pain dissected and examined by strangers. But it also meant that Robert Thomas Brennan would finally face consequences for what he had done to me and to other women. It meant that my voice would be heard, that my truth would be officially acknowledged. "I'll do it," I told Mrs. Carter one crisp October morning as we sat in her office reviewing the legal documents. "I'll testify." She smiled and reached across the desk to squeeze my hand. "You're incredibly brave, Margaret. Not many women would have the courage to fight back the way you have." "I'm not doing it just for me," I said, thinking about the other victims mentioned in the police reports, about the women who might become victims in the future if Robert Brennan wasn't stopped. "I'm doing it for all of us." The trial was scheduled for January 1965. I had 6 months to prepare, 6 months to gather my strength and courage for what would be the most difficult challenge of my young life. But for the first time since that horrible wedding night, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just surviving, and that feeling gave me hope that maybe, eventually, I could not just rebuild my life but make it better and stronger than it had ever been before. The train ride to Denver in January 1965 was the longest journey of my life, and not just because of the miles covered. As the Nebraska prairie gave way to the foothills of Colorado, I watched my reflection in the window and barely recognized the young woman staring back at me. 7 months had passed since my wedding night, and while my physical wounds had healed, I carried invisible scars that would mark me forever. Dr. Williamson had prepared me extensively for what lay ahead. Testifying will be one of the most difficult things you've ever done, she had warned during our final session before the trip. Defense attorneys will try to make you doubt yourself, to make the jury doubt you. They'll question your memory, your motives, even your character. But remember, your truth is your power. Mrs. Carter accompanied me on the journey, her briefcase filled with documents and her mind sharp with strategy. She had coordinated with the Colorado prosecutor, District Attorney Michael Hastings, a man with a reputation for taking domestic violence cases seriously at a time when most prosecutors considered them private family matters. The key, she had explained as we reviewed my testimony for the 100th time, is to speak clearly and directly. Don't let them rattle you with their tricks. Just tell the truth exactly as it happened. The Denver courthouse was an imposing brick building that seemed to stretch toward the gray January sky. Inside, the hallways echoed with the sound of footsteps and hushed conversations, lawyers in dark suits carrying leather briefcases, court reporters wheeling their stenography machines, and witnesses like myself trying to look braver than we felt. I met the other victims for the first time in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. There were 5 of us in total, women ranging in age from 19 to 26, from small towns across Colorado, Wyoming, and Kansas. Each had a story similar to mine: a charming courtship, a quick engagement, a wedding night that turned into a nightmare, and an abandonment that left them broken and wondering what they had done wrong. Sarah from Grand Junction was 22 and had been married to Robert for 3 days before he disappeared with her family's savings. Linda from Cheyenne was 19 and had lost a baby just as I had, though hers had been further along in the pregnancy. Janet from Topeka was 24 and bore scars on her arms from where Robert had burned her with cigarettes when she tried to resist. "I can't believe there are so many of us," whispered Amy, the youngest at 19, her voice barely audible in the small room. "I thought I was the only one stupid enough to fall for his lies." "We weren't stupid," said Linda firmly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised me. "We were targeted by a predator who spent years perfecting his technique. There's a difference." District Attorney Hastings joined us for a final briefing. He was a tall, serious man in his 40s with graying temples and eyes that had seen, too, much human cruelty. But when he spoke to us, his voice was gentle and respectful. "Ladies, I want you to understand how important your testimonies are. This man has been operating across state lines for at least 8 years that we know of. He's destroyed lives, stolen money, and committed acts of violence that would make hardened criminals sick. You are the voices of justice not just for yourselves, but for every woman he might hurt in the future." The trial began on a Monday morning in February. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from several newspapers, law enforcement officials, curious members of the public, and Robert's family, who had traveled from Omaha to support him despite mounting evidence of his crimes. Seeing Robert again for the first time since our wedding night was like being struck by lightning. He sat at the defense table wearing a well-tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, his expression one of injured innocence. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked exactly what he had pretended to be: a successful, respectable businessman, falsely accused by vindictive women. But I knew better now. I could see past the mask to the monster underneath, and that knowledge gave me strength. The prosecution built their case methodically. They presented evidence of Robert's pattern of using false identities, of moving from town to town seeking out vulnerable young women of the meticulous planning that went into each of his cons. They showed bank records, forged documents, and testimony from hotel clerks and business associates who had witnessed his deceptions. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they were made of water. The bailiff swore at me in, and I placed my hand on the Bible, promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. District Attorney Hastings approached me with a kind smile. "Miss Thompson," he began, using my maiden name, "since my marriage had been annulled, would you please tell the court how you first met the defendant, Robert Thomas Brennan?" For the next 3 hours, I told my story. I spoke about the courtship, about falling in love with a man who never existed, about the wedding that should have been the happiest day of my life. And then, with the entire courtroom listening in stunned silence, I described the wedding night that had nearly killed me. The hardest part was describing the loss of my pregnancy. As I spoke about the baby I had never known I was carrying, I could see several jurors wipe away tears. Even the court reporter, a middle-aged woman who had probably heard every kind of human tragedy, looked affected by my testimony. "Miss Thompson," District Attorney Hastings said gently, "did the defendant ever express any remorse for what he had done to you?" "No," I replied, my voice stronger than I had expected. "He abandoned me at the hospital and disappeared. I never saw him again until today." When it came time for cross-examination, Robert's defense attorney, a slick-haired man named Gerald Hawkins, approached me like a predator stalking wounded prey. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "this has clearly been a very traumatic experience for you. Is it possible that in your emotional state, you might be misremembering some of the details of that night?" "No," I said firmly. "I remember everything clearly." "But you had been drinking champagne, hadn't you, at your wedding reception and again in the hotel room?" "I had 2 glasses at the reception and 1 in the hotel room. I was not intoxicated." "You were also a virgin, weren't you, Miss Thompson? Inexperienced in marital relations?" The question was designed to embarrass me, to make me seem naive and unreliable. But Dr. Williamson had prepared me for this line of attack. "Yes, I was inexperienced," I said calmly. "But I know the difference between consensual intimacy and violent assault. What Robert Brennan did to me was assault, not marriage relations." Hawkins continued his attack for nearly 2 hours, trying to paint me as a woman scorned, as someone seeking revenge against a husband who had simply left her. He questioned my timeline, my memories, even my motives for pressing charges. But I held firm. Every time he tried to shake my testimony, I responded with clear, factual statements. When he suggested that I was lying for attention or money, I pointed out that I had sought no financial compensation and had tried to keep the matter private until learning about his other victims. "Miss Thompson," Hawkins said during his final attempt to discredit me, "isn't it true that you filed these charges only after your husband disappeared with another woman? Isn't this really just a case of a jealous wife seeking revenge?" "Mr. Hawkins," I said, looking directly at the jury, "I filed these charges because Robert Brennan is a dangerous predator who has hurt multiple women. I testified today not for revenge, but to prevent him from hurting anyone else. If that makes me vindictive in your eyes, then I accept that label gladly." The courtroom erupted in applause, and the judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. Over. The next week, the other victims testified, each adding another layer to the prosecution's case. Sarah described how Robert had convinced her to give him access to her family's bank accounts before disappearing. Linda testified about the miscarriage she had suffered after Robert's violence, her voice breaking as she described holding her dead baby. Janet showed the jury the scars on her arms, permanent reminders of Robert's cruelty. The defense tried the same tactics with each of us, suggesting we were lying, confused, or seeking revenge. But we had prepared for this, and we supported each other through our testimonies. When one of us faltered, the others provided strength through their presence and their shared understanding of what we had endured. Robert himself never took the stand. His attorneys advised against it, probably knowing that he would be unable to maintain his facade of innocence under cross-examination. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Thomas Brennan, guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, his voice echoing in the packed courtroom. The charges included 5 counts of aggravated assault, 3 counts of sexual assault, 2 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of unborn children, multiple counts of fraud, and 1 count of kidnapping. In total, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. As the bailiff led Robert away in handcuffs, he turned to look at us, his victims, who had found the courage to speak truth to power. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw pure hatred in his eyes. But I also saw something else: defeat. We had won. Not just the trial, but our lives back. That evening, the 5 of us sat in a small restaurant near the courthouse, sharing a meal and reflecting on what we had accomplished. We were no longer just victims. We were survivors who had stood up to evil and won. "What will you do now?" Linda asked me as we prepared to part ways and return to our respective homes. "I'm going to live," I said simply. "Really live, not just survive. And I'm going to help other women who go through what we went through." It was a promise I would keep for the rest of my life. The train ride back to Nebraska felt different from the journey out. I was still the same woman who had suffered an unspeakable trauma, but I was also someone who had found the courage to fight back, to speak truth in the face of power, and to help ensure that a dangerous predator could never hurt anyone else. The Colorado mountains faded behind me and the familiar Nebraska prairie stretched ahead, I realized that my real life was just beginning. Not the fairy tale life I had imagined at 18, but something better. A life built on truth, courage, and the knowledge that I was stronger than anything that had tried to break me. The girl who had walked down the aisle in Cedar Falls 7 months earlier was gone forever. In her place was a woman who had looked evil in the face and refused to be silenced by it, and that woman was ready to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Returning to Cedar Falls after the trial felt like stepping into a different world. The town looked the same tree-lined streets, the same white church steeple reaching toward the sky, the same familiar faces behind store counters, but I was fundamentally changed. The girl who had left for Denver was gone, replaced by a woman who had stared down a monster in a courtroom and emerged victorious. The local newspaper had covered the trial extensively, and suddenly I wasn't just poor Margaret who had that terrible accident on her honeymoon. I was Margaret Thompson, the brave young woman who had helped put a dangerous criminal behind bars. The shift in how people looked at me was both liberating and overwhelming. "Margaret," Mrs. Adelaide Foster said when I stopped by the library a few days after returning home, "I want you to know how proud this whole town is of you. What you did took incredible courage." But not everyone shared her sentiment. Some people, particularly older residents who believed that family matters should stay private, viewed my public testimony as airing dirty laundry unnecessarily. "I don't understand why she had to make such a spectacle of herself," I overheard Mrs. Jameson telling her bridge club one afternoon. "In my day, women handled these things quietly." These comments stung, but they no longer had the power to shame me into silence. I had learned that speaking the truth wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. The real transformation in my life began when I received a letter from Dr. Patricia Mendez, a social worker in Omaha who had read about the trial in the newspapers. "Dear Miss Thompson," the letter began, "I have been working with victims of domestic violence for several years, and I was deeply moved by your courage in testifying against Robert Brennan. I wonder if you would be interested in joining a small group of women who are working to establish support services for victims of domestic abuse in Nebraska. The letter went on to explain that Dr. Mendez and several other women were in the early stages of creating what would eventually become Nebraska's first domestic violence shelter. They needed women who understood the experience firsthand to help design programs and advocate for funding. "We need voices like yours," the letter concluded. "Women who have survived and can show others that survival is possible." I wrote back immediately, accepting her invitation to join the group. 3 weeks later, I took my first trip to Omaha as an advocate rather than a victim. The meeting was held in the basement of St. Mary's Catholic Church, around a folding table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Besides Dr. Mendez, there were 6 other women present, a mix of social workers, survivors, and concerned community members. The woman who would become my closest ally in this work was Catherine Kate Rodriguez, a fierce, compassionate woman, in her 30s, who had escaped an abusive marriage 5 years earlier. "The biggest problem we face," Kate explained during that first meeting, "is that there's nowhere for women to go. They can't leave their abusers because they have no money, no place to stay, no support system, and law enforcement often treats domestic violence as a private matter, not a crime." Dr. Mendez outlined their vision: a safe house where women and children could stay while they rebuilt their lives, combined with counseling services, legal aid, and job training programs. It was ambitious, especially for 1965, when such services were virtually non-existent. "We need someone who can speak to the legislature," Dr. Mendez said, looking directly at me. "Someone who can put a human face on this issue. Margaret, your story has already been in the newspapers. People know who you are. Would you be willing to testify before the state legislature about the need for these services?" The thought of speaking publicly again, this time to lawmakers rather than a jury, was terrifying. But I thought about Linda, Sarah, Janet, and Amy, my fellow survivors who had found the courage to speak their truth. I thought about all the women who hadn't been as fortunate as we were, who hadn't had the support systems or legal representation to seek justice. "Yes," I said, "I'll do it." Over the next year, I split my time between Cedar Falls and Omaha, working with Dr. Mendez's group to develop what would become the Nebraska Domestic Violence Prevention Act. I learned about legislative processes, about how to write compelling testimony, about how to build coalitions with other advocacy groups. My first appearance before the state legislature was in March 1966. I stood at a podium in the Capitol building, looking out at a room full of mostly male lawmakers, and told my story once, again. But this time, I focused not just on what had happened to me, but on what needed to change to prevent it from happening to others. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "domestic violence is not a private family matter. It is a crime that destroys lives, breaks apart families, and costs our state millions of dollars in medical expenses, lost productivity, and social services. We need laws that protect victims, programs that help them rebuild their lives, and a justice system that takes these crimes seriously." The room was silent when I finished. Then slowly, several legislators began asking questions, not the hostile, victim-blaming questions I had faced from defense attorneys, but genuine inquiries about what solutions might work. Senator William Hart, a respected Republican from Lincoln, approached me afterward. "Miss Thompson, that was the most compelling testimony I've heard in 20 years of serving in this legislature. You can count on my support for whatever legislation you and Dr. Mendez propose." The bill we eventually drafted wasn't perfect. It was limited by the social attitudes of the time and the political realities of getting anything passed. But it was a start. It established the first state funding for domestic violence shelters, created mandatory training for police officers on handling domestic violence calls, and strengthened legal protections for victims. The Nebraska Domestic Violence Prevention Act passed in 1967 making Nebraska one of the first states in the country to address domestic violence as a public policy issue rather than a private family matter. But my real work was just beginning. In 1968, with the help of a small federal grant and donations from local churches and businesses, we opened Safe Harbor House, Nebraska's first domestic violence shelter. It was a modest 2-story building in downtown Omaha that could house up to 12 women and their children. I was hired as the first director, a position that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Running a shelter was unlike anything I had ever done. I was part counselor, part administrator, part advocate, and part mother figure to dozens of women who arrived at our door with nothing but the clothes on their backs and children clinging to their skirts. There was Maria, a young mother of 3 who spoke no English, but whose bruises told a story that needed no translation. There was Beverly, a college-educated woman whose husband was a respected doctor who had convinced everyone that she was mentally unstable. There was Dolores, a grandmother who had endured 40 years of abuse before finally finding the courage to leave. Each woman who came through our doors taught me something new about resilience, about courage, about the complex reasons why women stay in abusive relationships and what it takes to help them leave. One of the most challenging cases was Rachel, a teenager not much younger than I had been when I married Robert. She arrived at Safe Harbor with a black eye and a split lip. But what worried me most was the dead look in her eyes. The same look I had seen in my own reflection after that horrible wedding night. "I don't know why I came here," she told me during our first counseling session. "He's going to find me anyway. He always does." "Rachel," I said, sitting across from her in the small counseling room we had set up in what used to be the building's kitchen. "I want to tell you something that someone should have told me when I was 18. You are not responsible for what he does to you. You are not weak for staying, and you are not foolish for leaving. You are brave for being here." Over the weeks that followed, I watched Rachel slowly come back to life. She enrolled in cosmetology school through our job training program, started smiling again, and began making plans for a future that didn't include fear. "How did you do it?" she asked me one day as we worked together in the shelter's garden. A project I had started because I remembered how much peace I had found in my mother's garden during my own recovery. "Do what?" I asked, though I knew what she meant. "How did you go from being a victim to being this?" She gestured around the shelter, at the other women working in the garden, at the life I had built from the ashes of my destroyed marriage. "I realized that my pain had a purpose," I said, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. "I could either let what happened to me destroy me, or I could use it to help other women avoid the same fate. The choice was mine. By 1970, Safe Harbor House had expanded to include a second location, and we were serving over 200 women and children each year. We had helped draft similar legislation in 3 other states, and I was frequently invited to speak at conferences and universities about domestic violence prevention. My personal life had also begun to heal. In 1969, I met David Martinez, a gentle patient man who worked as a counselor at the community mental health center. He had been referring clients to our shelter, and our professional relationship gradually became personal. David was everything Robert had pretended to be: kind, honest, supportive of my work, and completely secure in his own masculinity. He never tried to control me or change me, and he understood that my work with domestic violence survivors wasn't just a job, but a calling. "Are you sure you want to get involved with someone who comes with so much baggage?" I asked him one evening, as we walked along the Missouri River, talking about our growing feelings for each other. "Margaret," he said, stopping to face me, "your experiences don't make you damaged goods. They make you who you are. One of the strongest, most compassionate people I've ever met. Your past isn't baggage. It's the foundation of your strength." We married in 1971 in a small ceremony at the shelter with the women and children we served as our witnesses. It was everything my first wedding should have been: a celebration of love between two people who truly knew and accepted each other. David and I were never able to have biological children. The damage from Robert's violence had indeed affected my fertility, as Dr. Harrison had warned. But we became parents in other ways, to the dozens of children who came through the shelter, to the young women who needed guidance and support, to the community of survivors we helped build. As I stand here today, 62 years after that horrible wedding night, I can honestly say that my life has been full and meaningful. Not the life I planned when I was 18, but a better one built on truth, compassion, and service to others. Safe Harbor House is still operating today, though it's grown into a statewide network of shelters and services. The Nebraska Domestic Violence Prevention Act has been updated and strengthened dozens of times, and thousands of women have found safety, healing, and new beginnings because a group of us decided that speaking the truth was more important than maintaining silence. Robert Brennan died in prison in 1987, having served 22 years of his sentence. I felt no joy at his death, but I did feel a sense of closure. The monster who had tried to destroy me was gone, but the good that had come from fighting against him would continue long after both of us were gone. My dear ones, if you take nothing else from my story, please remember this. Your worst moments do not define you. What defines you is what you choose to do with those moments. You can let them destroy you, or you can use them to build something beautiful for yourself and others. The choice, as it always has been, is yours. I am 78 years old now, and while my body shows the wear of decades of hard work and advocacy, my spirit remains strong. Every day, I receive letters from women who tell me that my story gave them hope, that seeing what I built from the ashes of my destroyed marriage helped them believe that they could rebuild their own lives. That, my beautiful soul, is the greatest gift I could ever receive. The knowledge that my pain was not meaningless, that my choice to speak the truth created ripples of healing that continue to spread long after I stepped into that courtroom in Denver. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that survivors deserve to be heard. And remember, no matter what darkness you may be facing today, dawn is always possible. With all my love and hope for your healing, Grandma Maggie up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.